Welcome to this week's Real Talk Food Safety with Jill and Tia. And as you can see, our special guest.
Hello, welcome. Welcome to our guests and welcome to our audience. We are in for a treat today. Consumer reports is something that is very close to the work that we do, right? Many of us use consumer reports, but we need a little under the hood. Let's look underneath on how consumer reports are put together and how we could use them even more in our roles. And we're sure the audience has some questions too, because we know people have even connected with us on, oh man, I can't wait to watch this week. So say hello to us in the comments so that we'll see you out there. Let us know where you are watching from. And then, of course, add your comments, add your questions, because we will incorporate them in today's show.
Yes. Yes, we are going to do formal introductions in a moment or more, but we have Jim and Brian here from Consumer Reports. Welcome. It's so great to have you on the show today.
Yeah, great to be with you.
Yeah. Yes.
So I'm always curious because I think I shared when we even jumped on that when I think of consumer reports, and others have told me as well, they're thinking about using it to do research for like new appliances or a new vehicle or insert something there, but they don't often think of it with food safety. So do you hear that a lot?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of us who've read the publication throughout our lifetimes, whenever we've gone shopping for vehicles, our first thought is, oh, I want to, check out what Consumer Reports is saying. And you're certainly not thinking about it from a food perspective, but food has a really interesting space within Consumer Reports because it's not something that people typically think about, right? As you indicated. But it is content, it is work that they value. So, once they become subscribers, they certainly appreciate and respond to that content, to that work. It certainly resonates with them, and it plays out when we review kind of the number of clicks that we get and the type of responses we get to certain stories. So food plays kind of an underrated, important part within Consumer Reports.
And plus, since, as you know, Consumer Reports cares about safety, our car testing always involves the safety aspect, baby seats. We care about safety in the food space also. I'm actually the director of product safety, which talks about food and other products and the safety. And we just want to make sure that consumers know that there is a safe way, just like there's a safe way to pick a car. There's a safe way to choose your food, prepare your food, store your food. And here's some information that we have that can help you do all that.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm delighted that you're here today, because I think in the food industry, we may not realize how much work you're doing at Consumer Reports in the food safety space. So
yeah, and I think it's important to the work that we do in industry and academia. And as we get even closer tied to consumers, right, which is a goal of the FDA around consumer education. And we're just talking more and more about consumers, their role in food safety, but also how do we help in their role in food safety. And so I would say it's definitely a very relevant topic that's top of mind for people in the industry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you see this playing out over the last 10 to 15 years where consumers really want to know more about what's in their food. And they're very much more focused on it maybe than they've ever been. I'm sure the industry is seeing that, and we're certainly seeing that as well.
Yeah.
Well, in our space is really our mission at Catalyst is how do we transforming how we lead in food? Because we know that where we are today, we've come a long way, but to get where we want to be, not only from an industry, but also for being good partners with our consumers, we have to do things differently. And so at Catalyst, we use coaching-based principles to really think about leadership and how we interact with people, how we expand our perspectives, and how we are the ones who have to step into that space.
Yeah.
And so I think even as we talk about, with our audience, to be a leader and step into this space and do something new, knowing that there's another resource like Consumer Reports to help us have new perspectives is a really powerful tool for us to have in our belt.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's dive in a little bit. Let's first start with a little introduction. So just in case our audience don't know who you are, Jim, or you, Brian, we would love for each of you to talk a little bit about who you are. How did you find yourself supporting the food industry? How did you find yourself at Consumer Reports? And Jim, we'll start with you.
Okay. So all my professional life, I've been in food and water microbiology. I did my master's at Miami of Ohio, where I worked on amino acid biosynthesis. Did my PhD at Michigan, where I looked at the waterborne pathogen Legionella, who causes Legionnaire's disease. Then I pivoted a little bit and did my postdoc with Alison O'Brien, who was one of the leading scientists working on Shiga toxin producing E. coli. And I worked on trying to figure out ways to actually treat patients that may have this devastating disease and try to prevent, progressive death or serious injury. Tried academia for a little bit and it didn't fit. And so my first job was with the DoD, both with Navy and the Army. And while I was at the Army, I developed methods on detecting biowarfare agents in food using the same machinery that regular food laboratories would use to analyze food. And then that transitioned into the Food Emergency Response Network back then. And so I did that for a while, and I started working for the USDA. And I was the baseline studies director and did that for a while. Then I transitioned into other projects, including working with the Chief Scientist's Office and then the Federal Advisory Committee, NACMT. And that's where I met this guy at USDA because he was in charge of NACMT as the executive of the USDA. And I stayed there for a while, but then I wanted to do something different. I'd never worked for a nonprofit. I've never worked for the food industry itself. The opportunity at Consumer Reports came along, and it was to revive the food testing program that had laid dormant for a little while. And so that's how I actually ended up at Consumer Reports. And somehow this guy followed me there too. And so I actually interviewed him for the job while I was. And so we both work out of the Washington, D.C. office. But we were talking earlier, I have to go up to Yonkers and he has to travel at times. So that's kind of how I got to Consumer Reports.
All right. Yeah.
How you point out it's such a small world.
Yeah.
In food safety.
Yeah, it is. It is. And you two are close to me. I'm in Baltimore.
Oh, okay.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. But this guy is great. I'm glad he came to Consumer Reports because we kind of have a hive mind about food safety and what Consumer Reports can do, what regulatory agencies can do. And so we work well together and collaborate well together. So.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, high praise, Brian.
Yeah, right. How do I follow that? My career isn't as distinguished as Dr. J, but I'm sort of more of a Forrest Gump type when it comes to food policy, in that I just happen to be at the right place at the right time in certain moments. So I think my introduction to food policy, food safety, particularly began when I worked as a congressional staffer for Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut. And she is someone who is very active on food safety, food policy, and that was within my issue portfolio. And so that was my introduction to this arena. And that's how I was able to get to know a lot of folks, both in the industry side, consumer advocacy, academia, et cetera. And then after that, I was appointed as Deputy Undersecretary for Food Safety at USDA under the Obama administration, and joined the administration in 2011. And I rode it to the end until we had to turn off the lights in early 2017. And so did some consulting work, as a lot of folks in Washington do, once my political appointment had expired. And then when I seen that the director of food policy advocacy opened up at Consumer Reports, it certainly was a brand that was very, very appealing to me. Like we all talk about, it's a brand that's ingrained in us when we want to kind of know what the consumer voice is, or get kind of independent reviews of products. And so the prospect of being associated with that brand and working on an issue that I really love was certainly exciting. And so it was a great opportunity, very fortunate. So I've been with Consumer Reports now for 4.5 years. And it's been a fun ride. And it's, as Jim mentioned, it's such a treat to work with him and collaborate with our different divisions and making sure that we're doing the right thing by consumers.
Yeah. So fascinating, your backgrounds.
It is. And before we go forward, Jim, I'm curious, because I know on your LinkedIn profile, it states that you are a food safety curmudgeon. I'm like, where does that come from, and what does that mean for you?
I tend to be very conservative when it comes to food safety. And let me tell you a quick story. So we did a story about don't wash your chicken. Okay. Because the concern is you wash it in the sink, it splashes, the aerosols go around, you could spread salmonella across your chicken, any food that's sitting next to it or whatever. I got some of the biggest slams by either coworkers saying, well, I'm going to wash my chicken anyway. My grandmother washed their chicken and da-da-da-da-da. Online, I got slammed. TikTok, Instagram, I just got slammed. And I tried to explain to people there's good scientific reasons not to wash your chicken. Well, it's dirty and it has this. I'm like, but still, you can spread these bacteria in your kitchen to make people sick. And so I just had to dig in my heels, because then people would say, well, what if I do this? And how if I do this? And I wash my hands all the time. And I'd say, well, there's a USDA study that says you probably don't wash your hands enough. So I just had to stick to my guns. And even this past Thanksgiving, someone's mother sent a message directly to me to say, you tell him that I'm going to wash my turkey anyway. I'm like, okay. So that because I have to be kind of gruff and, kind of stubborn, that's why I put that up there. So
that's so funny. I of course remember that report. It's so funny. I did not even put it together that you were the one that wrote it.
Yeah. Well, I didn't write it, but what I did is I advised on it, and I did a lot of the social media. So I did a lot. I actually did an Instagram thing about why you shouldn't wash your chicken. And so that kind of got it out there in the social media sphere. And I got slammed for it. I can't think of one person, especially in Black and Caribbean communities, that do not want to take that advice. They're going to say no. They're going to reject it totally. So
it's true.
And I warned the writer. I said, just wait. When this comes out, we're going to get some flack for it. So.
Oh yeah, we certainly did. I caught some of that flack too, Jim.
Oh, that still comes up. There's memes.
Right?
There's memes and everything. And I always chuckle, since I spent about 14 years in the poultry industry. I always just want to say, folks, believe me, they are washing your chicken multiple times in multiple ways.
Well, I think there's a whole piece around consumers where, there's this balance of which, Jim, I have so many questions, but I'm not going to derail today's conversation.
Okay.
But there is this balance, right, of history, of generational tasks and procedures, for lack of better words, that are flowing down through generations, right? And then there's also the scientific piece that's learning, right? That's researching, that's providing guidance. And I think that's one of the hard parts around just consumers in general and consumer education, is that we're in this boat of being technical and understanding the science behind it, and how do we educate, but also being mindful of traditions, generational traditions is what I was meaning to say. Like, how do we also be mindful of that? Because, I mean, honestly every holiday, right? I'm also having the conversation. So Jim, you're not the only one that's standing firm in it, because like you said, brown and black communities, like it's a part of our traditions, it's a part of our techniques, honestly, on how we cook. And so having those conversations with friends and family, we're in those conversations. So I think that's interesting.
We're totally in the conversation, because my daughter, when a report is about to come out, she'll say, okay, what can I eat now? Right. And your point about that there are different cultures of food out there, one has to be aware of that, because then you need to tailor your messaging to that particular culture.
Yeah, right.
Now, Consumer Reports, we tend to not be very, very pedantic about it. A lot of times the messaging is, this is what we found, this is what we recommend you do. But if you don't want to do that, that's okay too. But we're just saying, here's a better way, here's a safer way to prevent exposure, let's say to heavy metals or something like that. And then also being aware of the culture itself as to how they buy food, how they prepare it, how they store it, and trying to give advice kind of around that, but always sticking to the best food safety information and advice that we can give. And they're going to choose to do it or not. But we're hoping, especially as we target consumers in the younger ages, the more diverse consumers using social media, et cetera, that possibly we can get that message. We may not see the results today, but we can get that message within the cultures, and it'll flow down to later generations, maybe that maybe we shouldn't wash our chicken in the sink and contaminate the entire thing. Because we even included a graphic of it goes like a 3-foot cone all the way around the person. And you know, so maybe they'll remember that and say, well, maybe I shouldn't wash it this time. So
which really kind of underscores some of the challenges in food, because it is so personal and it's emotional, and it's tied to so many different parts of our lives that when we look at it kind of mechanically and scientifically, right? Sometimes our brains don't always go, this is what should happen, or these are the risks, but here's what we do and here's what I know. And so I think that really comes together to even think about, kind of coming back to the work that you do at Consumer Reports, and like, how does that impact what you work on or how you approach things? So I'm kind of curious how.
It's a great point
for you.
Yeah, it's a great point, Jill, and Jim brought this up too. It's kind of it's almost difficult sometimes to kind of thread that needle, right? Because we don't want to be viewed or perceived as the food police. Like, don't eat this, don't eat that. That's not what we're about. But what we want to do, and as Jim indicated, is we want to present all of the information that we have and what's available, especially from a science-based perspective, and present that to consumers in a way where it's easy to understand, so they can ultimately make the choices that's best for their families. So I mean, it is something that we kind of have to navigate on a constant basis. And I think, a lot of times we'll come out with a list of risky foods, just based on the data, the recall data that's available. And a lot of it happens to be fresh produce items. But we certainly don't want to convey the message that people should avoid fresh produce items because they're important for a healthy diet. But we want to present, the information on the risks that are out there and the steps that they could take to minimize it.
Yeah. I think one thing comes up to me as we're having this conversation, and Daniela, thanks for posting. She posted a link to the Instagram video Jim talked about. But I'm curious, how has social media impacted the work that you all are doing at Consumer Reports?
Well, Tia, here's the issue. We're still trying to figure that out in some ways. One of the biggest concerns that myself and my nutritionist, Amy Keating, has is the bad information that's out there.
Oh, yes.
Because sometimes you will have social media influencers that have no background in food safety or nutrition, advising people as to how to eat, when to eat, what to eat. They may be actually pitching products that they're getting paid for to pitch by companies that, again, they still have no idea that whether it's good for you or not. We try not to get into a fight with the social media influencers, but sometimes we want to. For instance, when the Kardashians came out with the flat tummy tea, someone said, "You need to address this on social media," and I'm like, I'm not getting into that crossfire right there. And then the pink sauce that came out recently, where a person was putting, and I'm like, we have to do something, but it's kind of hard how to navigate. What can you say? So what we tend to do is we will address the big things, but we'll also refer consumers to the food safety websites of the FDA, the USDA, the CDC, and try to send them to where to get the best information. But like I said, we're still trying to negotiate what's the best way to use social media, but we try very hard. I mean, I've done a lot of stuff on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook on different food safety aspects, and Daniela's shared one of them to try to get some good information, some good advice, some solid advice that's based on science and regulatory science to help consumers. But as you noted at the beginning of the show, not a lot of people know us. And we're trying to grow that market. We're trying to grow that audience so we can get this information that we believe is science-based and can help out there to as many people as possible.
Yeah. And you say sometimes, social media influencers may not understand, right, the food safety or even their product. It's probably most of the time influencers do not understand that.
I'm threading the needle to you.
I know you are.
The needle here, okay?
I said it, not Jim. I said most of but I would say that's also expected because like we spend a lot of time in this industry, right? And we've our backgrounds are in this work or parallel to the work. Like this is what we do versus our consumers, many of it is not what they do, right? They're specialists in marketing and in social media and other areas that they know so much more than we do about those areas. And so, some of it is like we should expect that. But when we see reports or even product like, the pink sauce coming out where someone is trying to inform or even launch a product, right? But don't know really the true background, the data behind it, the safety precautions behind it, that's when we have, issues.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we have actually discussed, and Brian could maybe help with this. Is there something that the FDA or the USDA can do about false advertising, false information being put out there? Probably not because of First Amendment rules and so on and so forth. But I think that even just putting out counter messaging might even help too. And I've noticed that just recently the USDA and FDA are doing more social media, and in my opinion, better social media, because when I was there, I didn't think it was that great. But hopefully our regulators can also see that there's some really bad stuff out there and start having the conversations. What can we do about it?
That's
right.
Well, and for some of our audience that's joining us, like Tim and Damaris and Megan, thank you for being out there.
Yes.
They may be wondering too, like what you mentioned a little bit about providing consumers information so they can make good choices for their families and for themselves. So is that the overarching mission of what Consumer Reports does in this food safety space? And I'm curious, has it changed? But I'm also curious if you'd share like the specific parts that you both work on, because it is a little bit different. And you mentioned this kind of collaboration together.
Right. You want to go?
Yeah, sure. So I think the best way to go about this is just to kind of describe how Consumer Reports is structured, right? So we obviously have the publication, which everyone is familiar with, the content piece, the magazine, the website, et cetera. And then you have the testing part, which Jim is part of and leads the food safety part. They're the ones that test all the products. The cars, the track that we have in Connecticut that does all the car testing. And if you go to our headquarters in Yonkers, on certain floors, you'll see a bunch of appliances lined up in the hallway ready to be tested. et cetera. And then the third piece is the advocacy, which is what I'm part of, and working with lawmakers, policymakers, and companies to kind of affect change. And I think the bottom line is, there's a common thread woven in our mission over the years. Like some of the key words, buzzwords may change, but ultimately it's about creating a fair and just marketplace and putting consumers first. That's kind of the core mission for us, and that's what drives all of our divisions, is achieving that mission, achieving those types of goals that feed into that mission. And that's pretty much what the foundation for us is, and guides our work.
Yes.
Yeah, that's awesome. I like how you talk about just that connection between policy, right, and what's happening in regulatory and the government, right, the laws that they're making. Are there any ones that kind of come top of mind, specifically in food, that you all have worked with to help push the dial around food safety policy, food safety regulation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to look at food safety policy and just food safety in general is kind of its short-term and long-term impacts, right? So obviously on the short term, it's kind of the types of risks and threats that pose immediate danger to consumers, immediate risk to consumers. So it's, the pathogens, E. coli, listeria, salmonella, it's norovirus, all of those. What are the policies that kind of drive those discussions to kind of reduce risk for consumers, right? And so currently we're doing some work on the salmonella in poultry, and trying to work with a coalition to push that forward, working with USDA. And then when you take a step back and look at the longer term threats, kind of like the heavy metals, we've done a lot of work, and Jim's team has done some testing on this. Same with food chemicals and additives and synthetic food dyes. Those are difficult to have a kind of a direct causation link, right? But it does have a long-term impact on consumers. So what are the types of policies, what are the types of testing projects that we could do to kind of help inform that policy arena to affect change? So that's kind of how we approach it. And also factoring in, what resonates with our members, our subscribers, based on the stories that they're clicking on, the petitions they're signing, factoring all of that in and trying to craft the strategy and agenda from all fronts, whether it's testing and whether it's advocacy.
Yeah.
And Tia, what my job is when I can is to support Brian with testing data. So for instance, he mentioned the salmonella, change in salmonella policy for poultry. We've tested poultry, we've tested chicken before for salmonella, for Campylobacter. We've done whole genome sequencing. We provide all that data to our regulatory agencies. We do a data sharing with them. We do testing for antimicrobial resistance in the strains that we isolate. And we believe our results are very important because we only buy at retail. So we're not testing upstream in the factory. We're actually buying the same products that consumers would buy, just like we do our cars and our TVs, testing that so we can say, consumers, in this testing, this is what we found. This is what it could mean. And then we will share that data with Brian and his friends and his cohorts on the policy side, inside and outside of CR. We also try to publish our data too when we can.
Okay.
So all of our retail-based, consumer-based data is publicly available for use. When Brian is trying to do something advocacy-wise, we want to be able to support him whenever we can. He didn't mention the Closer to Zero. We've done a lot of baby food testing for heavy metals, and we've shared that data to help that effort also. And so when I can, I support Brian and try to help him with testing data. Our projects tend to be a little bit small because of resources, but the data is good. And so I think when he can use it, we love for him to use it. So.
Yeah. Yeah, you all touched on a lot of big things that's happening in food right now that's top of mind for us.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about food safety professionals as they're always looking, once again, for different sources of reliable data to understand risk and understand what their product, whether it's, obviously product risk, but right? Some of that rolls into brand risk for them as well. And so another credible source to be able to reach out to and see, especially if there's data there, and available for them to be able to use in their risk assessments and communications within their organizations. Goldmine.
Yeah.
So Jill, one of the things I did, because I've been with Consumer Reports about 7.5 years, is when we started reviving the food testing, I insisted that we use FDA, USDA food testing methods for two reasons. Number one, I remember being at the USDA and a report coming across my desk from Consumer Reports, actually, where they tested chicken back then, but I wasn't sure of the methods. And so I couldn't say for sure if their data was reliable. So we used the BAM, we used the MLG. You may be familiar with those manuals that they use. And we find labs that are ISO 17025 certified, that are under a quality system that we can visit at any time during the analysis of our products. And then we share that data, because I found that the USDA or the FDA trust our data more if we're using good labs and the right methodology. In fact, as a result of our testing of raw ground beef a couple of years ago, we actually detected 0157, and the USDA withdrew that product from the market the first time I'm told that they've used outside third-party data to actually initiate a recall.
Interesting.
And so I think because we have set the bar very, very high methodological wise and technique wise and reporting wise, plus the relationships that Brian has grown with our regulatory agencies, that they trust our data, and we share it with them freely, and we're willing to discuss it. So
and that is actually really interesting. And, you know, for someone that's worked in industry, right, our ears kind of perk up that of people doing testing of products, right? And that it's leading to decisions that FDA, USDA are using. So I'm curious, how's the relationship, or what type of working relationship do you have industry, if any?
Well, I want Brian to speak for sure on this one, because I think he's a little bit closer to industry than I am.
Closer in the sense that I probably have more conversations with them on a regular basis, just from an advocacy standpoint. We certainly encounter each other for a lot of these types of discussions, and honestly, I feel like I have a great working relationship with a lot of our industry counterparts. I'm very honest and transparent and upfront on the things that we're working on and that we're concerned about, just to let them know, give them a heads up on some of the stuff that we work on, just so that they can prepare and just to kind of facilitate the discussion. I think that is the approach that has always been taught to me, both, folks that I looked up to, especially my former boss, Rosa DeLauro, up on Capitol Hill. It's being open and honest to all perspectives, and using that, leveraging that for very kind of productive, fruitful discussions and relationships that can only be helpful ultimately, because we want the same thing, and ultimately consumers benefit from that. And so that ends up kind of working out well, and at least for us so far. We'll see. Certainly there's some tense moments that get created, that's bound to happen, but we're able to kind of work through that and maintain positive relationships with key industry players.
Now, on my side, whenever we write a report, a food testing report, we will provide to the industries and to the brands that we test a methods document, their individual results, and if we found something, give them a chance to respond. So for instance, if I'm testing Wendy's chicken nuggets for plasticizers and we found something there, we will reach out to Wendy's and say, here's 3 pieces of information that you could have. What is your response? And we give them a chance to respond. And so we will share their individual testing data with them. We won't share the lab we use, because that's proprietary information, but we will share the information and have conversations with them. Sometimes the conversations don't go that great because they're very angry or upset of our findings, or they say, well, you found this, but our own lab didn't find it. But we try to be as transparent as possible with our results and give them a chance to respond. And we will actually write in our articles or in our on our webpage what their response was. Now, the one response that kind of gets me the most is when they say, well, we're following FDA guidelines for the levels of X, knowing good and well that there are no levels set by the FDA yet.
Oh, I see.
And so when they say that, or they say, well, this is safe at this level. And I'm like, but who says, right? Because there are no levels set yet. So I'm like, we're going in this circular, thing.
Yeah.
One of the great things, though, is that sometimes you do meet with a company and they really want to help. They really want to be different. They really want to change things. And they'll really be honest with us and say, well, we can't do this now, but we'll work on that. And I think Brian has had a number of those conversations with industries that, based on our results and some of his nice, kind pressure, they're willing to at least try to address the issue with their product.
Yeah. Jim brings up an excellent point in that, having those honest conversations and keeping them confidential too. We've been able to secure commitments from companies to make some changes, and we only publicize it if that's something that they're comfortable with. But ultimately, what we want is a change that benefits consumers. If they want to publicize it, that's fantastic. But we obviously understand if they don't want to. But again, the bottom line is if we're able to kind of procure a change, that's good enough for us.
Yeah. I think I like the way you two describe the relationship you have with industry around collaboration and having these open and honest conversation. And obviously industry is a business, right? That's what they're focused on here. You are focusing on the consumer piece, and there's some overlap in that goal of protecting the consumer, right? Because the business is not going to exist if the consumer is not happy, right, with your product in any type of way. So there's this common goal that you all can talk about, even if there's some conversations where the two groups don't agree. I'm happy to hear that there are conversations that are happening and that there's some positive relationships there, because that, as food safety supporting the industry, that is our goal, right? Is to really protect that consumer and make sure that the product we're sending out is safe for consumption.
Well, Tia, I go into the conversations assuming the best intent, right? That if we found something in it, you may not have really known about it because maybe you don't test enough or you're not using a good lab or whatever. And so I just assume you want people to eat safe, good, wholesome food. And we're just trying to provide this information to you such that if we do have a finding, maybe it's not as great as you think it is. And, maybe you want to look into this a little bit deeper, because we will say, for instance, test incoming ingredients. Don't wait till the end product. Test the stuff that's coming in. Test along the way, along the whole manufacturing process. Test at the end, test the final product, and don't ship out something that's contaminated. And so we're willing to have these conversations because, for instance, like our test we did with spices, it would be very essential that you test before you include it in the final product. Look what happened to applesauce, right? So if you're not testing up front to make sure that what's going to be in the final product is safe and good, and I'm saying you test, don't rely on a certificate of authenticity or something like that.
Right.
You test to make sure that it's safe. Maybe it'll save you problems down the line.
Yeah.
But I know it's expensive. I know they're on very tight budgets and very tight profit margins and all the rest of that. But can you afford a recall? Right.
Good question. Yeah.
Right. So. And all because it's the way that we've done business. Does that mean it's the same way we do business as we go forward?
Yes. Yeah.
And that's one of the things that Tia and I often focus on, is that, once again, if we want different results, if we want better food safety outcomes, we want better business outcomes, then we have to be willing to do something different, and not just like slightly different. Sometimes we need to really think bigger picture. What's that going to look like down the road? And I think it's helpful even to know that we know there's groups like Consumer Reports that also give us another perspective. And I think it's really, powerful as food safety professionals to think about those optics. That's part of what our role is, to be able to, once again, understand risk, real or perceived, and how that comes through. So I think that's a really important aspect.
Yeah.
So
Megan had a question, Jim, as you were talking about spices and testing. He asked, what do you recommend for testing frequency and how to establish the risk for spices, or broad testing on all spices coming in being used as ingredients?
Well, with my experience of risk assessments, I usually hire someone to do them. I don't do them myself. My whole goal is that you have to have the data first to look at what is the incidence of contamination of that particular ingredient. You have to include volume, you have to include different types of brands, concentrations that you're going to use in your product, et cetera. Until you collect that data, you don't know. You don't know what the frequency of testing should be. At least that's my perspective. So until you can collect that data, you may have to start out with broad testing first, get you a baseline, and then you can determine how frequent that could be. I would certainly test any new ingredient provider that I've never worked with before, that I may not know much about. And since most, if not all, majority of our spices are imported. And so you may be relying on something over there, quote unquote, to ensure that they're actually shipping you safe and clean spices. And as you know, the food safety system in another country may not be equivalent to ours. And so I would probably, let's just say I owned a food company that I was starting out, I'd probably do broad testing initially to get my baseline numbers so I know what to expect, and then try to adjust my testing to fit that risk that we have calculated. And then again, when I have a new supplier, I may have to up that for a while until I get some more baseline data, and then adjust accordingly.
Yeah, I think about it as doing that validation phase of like, we're taking a bunch of samples, we're doing a bunch of testing to understand what our risk is, what that baseline is, and then going into verification of like doing a test every month, once a quarter, once a year, depending on, again, the risk of the product.
Yeah, and again, Megan, I'm never worked for food industry yet. And so this is just based on some outsider observations of some of the things that I've seen during my testing experiences over the last years.
True. But coming from the inside, I would agree.
Yeah. Very good answer.
Baseline and then refine.
Right.
Yeah. Great question, Megan. Thank you for asking.
So I know we've talked a little bit more about what kind of in the manufacturing setting, but you also brought up even, let's say, plasticizers and Wendy's for a nugget. And so I'm curious, like, how far, like, what's the scope of what Consumer Reports will cover for food? And I'm kind of leaning into a little bit, maybe from the policy side as well on this, because one of the things that I had thrown out for our group to talk a little bit about is just some of the differences in regulations in different states and different jurisdictions. And how does that even play into what you do at Consumer Reports? So I just stacked a few questions, and you can pull out the parts you want on that one and leave the rest.
Answer the question you want to answer. And
I guess so.
Hey, answer the question you have the answer for.
Right.
See, I just teed it up perfectly so you could do that.
Okay.
That's right. Dr. J, I'll let you lead off if you like.
Jill, specifically from the testing side, what would you like to know? I mean, because I think I also heard in there is how do we decide what to test? You said the depth and the breadth.
Yeah, what's all in the scope of when we think about kind of where Consumer Reports looks for providing information for consumers?
Okay, so as I mentioned, we only test at retail, whatever we can buy. We actually have secret shoppers that go out and buy the food. Before this, I actually just had a meeting about what we're going to test for the next fiscal year. So when I started, I had left the USDA right after they had considered risk-based testing for salmonella in poultry. And so when I came to CR, I said, not only are we going to use FDA and USDA methods, but we're also going to do risk-based. So I took the infamous Scanlon paper, which did, pairings of food and bacteria and determined risk. And that's how I made my first list of what were the most riskiest foods and what were the bacterial targets that we could test for. Couldn't do norovirus because I couldn't find a lab to test for norovirus, for instance, or hepatitis. And then we just started testing. So we started out with baby food and heavy metals. We started out with testing poultry, and it was our first nationwide test of poultry, actually. We started out testing lettuce, leafy greens, and so on and so forth, totally based on risk. How that progressed was that I then had to start folding in consumer interests, right? Because look, we are a magazine, we are a website, we go for members. And so we then have to start folding in what does our audience worry about? What are they concerned about? You can get that information from surveys, from conversations, from group conversations, and then you leaven that in. Then you also add age groups. So do we want a more diverse audience? Right? Our country is changing in diversity. And so what are the stories that would resonate with that audience? And then age, right? So as our typical Consumer Report member is aging out of Consumer Reports, that's also code word for they're passing away, right? We have to go younger and younger and younger to try to continue to feed in new members. So it went from totally risk-based testing to actually containing all these other factors. And then finally, what is Brian working on? Is there something that we can offer him for his efforts too? You know, for instance, he just did a bunch of work on different dyes and chemical additives into food. Should we consider testing for red dye number 3 or something like that in our future testing? And so, you know, it started a little, but now it's a little bit more difficult. And then you also have to test and figure out how are you going to use those results? Is it going to be strictly for the magazine or the website? What is going to be the social media play for this, right? What's going to be the comms play, TV, radio, podcasts, etc., something like this, right? And so it's a lot of moving pieces and parts and juggling. And again, with limited resources, there's only so much we can do. But we go through that process every year of picking the projects, and then I tuck away a little bit of resources for emergencies. We tested the applesauce and cinnamon pouches, for instance. That came up. It was not on my schedule, but we worked it in. So we put a little bit for emergency testing on the side just in case something comes up. And then that's how we decide on the projects that we're going to do, big picture and small picture. So.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question, Jill, but
it does, because I think knowing that, I mean, there's a very well thought out plan that you've clearly articulated, like all these different factors that play into it. So when someone actually sees something come out of Consumer Reports, it wasn't just like, gosh, on a whim, you happen to go test.
Right.
I have too little money to do something like that. I have to try to hit it out of the park every time.
I love it. There's that practical side.
Well, yeah. We don't do it all the time, but we do it a lot. I mean, like our dark chocolate bar story was the biggest food story that we've done. And then we followed that up with another chocolate story. That was a huge story. Our spices story was a huge story. I specifically picked that one because, again, the diversity of our culture here in the United States, our food culture, and it would resonate with different cultures that use different type of spices, and we throw a wide net as possible to get those spices, including trying to go into different areas, different bodegas and all the rest of that to try to get off-brand spices or non-label spices or whatever. We're working with Paramita Hore of the New York Department of Public Health right now to talk about how can we get into these little places to actually get these spices and all that. So
you talked about like you purchase things at retail. Do you do any testing at like restaurants or food service?
Yeah. So for instance, our plasticizer story, if we can get to it, we will test it. So if you read our plasticizer story, you would see we do fast food.
Okay.
When we look at food wrappers for PFAS or anything, we actually go into McDonald's, buy the Big Mac, take the wrapper off, and then test the wrapper. So yeah, we try to do that. It's a little bit more difficult to go into restaurants. So really the fast food, the carry out type of stuff is easier for us. But we have done a little bit of restaurant testing, but a lot of it's been revolving around the nutrient the nutrient content of different restaurant meals, the labeling. Can you find nutrition information somewhere in the restaurant about the meal you're about to eat, that type of thing, because it's a little bit more difficult to get in there. And then, as you said, food services, that's very difficult to get into. I mean, we've actually wanted to test school lunches, but can't get in there. So,
yeah,
you know,
so it's a little more difficult too. Okay.
yeah.
If you just want like a thumbs up or thumbs down, my kids would be happy to participate in that.
Well, you know, Jill, we were interested because the school lunch program of the USDA was starting to allow Lunchables as one of the items that they offered within the school lunch programs. Like, wait a second, all this processed meat and sodium, and really, how's that healthy for kids? But again, we couldn't get to the actual Lunchable that the USDA was okaying because the company had a different formulation than what we could buy at the local grocery store. So,
I see.
Yeah.
Well, with that, and this is just Tia being curious, like with those comments, do you all work with, I would say, work with groups like schools on what are they going to provide on from like a menu standpoint for lunch or for snacks? I have a toddler that's in school, so that's like super top of mind for me. And it's funny that me and my husband, he's also in food safety and quality in the food industry, and sometimes we're like, why is that a snack on this list? Like why? Just like basic recommendations that are out there. Why do the food not reflect what the recommendations are, even from a CDC standpoint? But I'm curious, do you all play in that space?
So Amy Keating, who's an excellent registered dietitian, whenever we write a story in that area, she always writes up recommendations, what to avoid, what you should eat, how you should eat, so on. I mean, she's a stickler about processed foods, for instance. And so she will add a section into the food safety report about nutrition, or she will have her total own articles about nutrition. However, we have not yet advised anyone as to what the nutrition should be outside of what's in the magazine.
Okay.
So,
and then Brian, on your side, do you do any advocacy work with schools and what's being provided to children?
Yeah, I mean, not as much as we would like. And a lot of it, as Jim mentioned, comes down to resources and bandwidth, and speaking of, from our promotions department, I hope folks consider subscribing to Consumer Reports. Digital subscriptions start at $39 a year. But
join us in our mission.
That's right.
The companies will help cover that for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it comes down to resource availability and bandwidth in terms of determining what we get involved in from an advocacy standpoint, and also just factoring in all of the things that you all had mentioned. What the members are responding to, what are kind of some of the trends going on in social media, and then also kind of identifying some opportunities that may exist at the federal policy level or at the state policy level, and making sure that we leverage that opportunity as much as possible while it exists.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yes. I'm always amazed at how quickly our time goes. And so I like to be very aware of that. And so I know we've talked about, different areas about where Consumer Reports plays. We've talked about policy. We've talked about manufacturing. I'm curious, for people who are either with us live or even on replay, would there be one or two things that you hope that the audience takes away from the conversation today as they think about food safety, either for themselves at home or even whatever role they are in related to, most likely our audience comes from food manufacturing, retail, food service?
Right. I would say that we shouldn't take food safety in particular for granted. And we always need to be vigilant. I think we would argue that there's maybe more burden on the consumer than there should be just in terms of what's in our food, you know, how the regulatory system is set up. So it requires a constant vigilance on the consumer part to, you know, track what's in food, track recalls to make sure they're not putting themselves at risk, and making sure that they're taking the appropriate steps at home, in terms of food safety handling, to minimize their risk. So, yeah, I would say that I would hope that for that to be the takeaway is, you know, just don't take anything for granted, and be constantly vigilant of the risks that are posed to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and to echo what Brian, I think it's sad that consumers have to do that, but look at it this way. We interface with food multiple times a day, 3 meals plus 2 snacks. So 5 times a day, you're interfacing with food somehow. Then count in the liquids you drink, right? Throughout the day, the water or coffee or whatever. You have to put in as much or even more vigilance as you would in buying a car. You buy a car 4, 5, 10 years. Look at all the research you did to choose the car that fits you and your needs, your budget, etc. Consumer Reports is famous for buying cars, right? But you're going to come to us much more often about food than you will a car, because you're not going to buy a car that often. So you have to consider, you're going to interface with food so often. Shouldn't you be the most informed, safe, aware, educated consumer that you can be, because you're going to put yourself potentially at risk multiple times a day if you make not wise choices as to what you eat, how you store it, how you prepare it, etc. And it's a shame we have to do that, but it is a reality, and I'm not sure consumers kind of really take that concept in deep, but that's what part of Consumer Reports tries to do. We try to lay it out to you in a very basic level that you can actually execute on. So if I say don't eat dark chocolate, pregnant people or children, because it can affect you, either the fetus or the child as they grow in their developmental stages, then that's easy data that you can take and use. If I say don't eat, or eat just a little bit, or eat milk chocolate instead, those are some of the pieces of advice that we give as recommendations so people can actually do something about this potential issue in your life.
Right. Yeah. I think this is really interesting the way you put that, Jim, around which we think about it, right? That we eat food all the time, and like the liquids that are also included. And I think sometimes from a consumer standpoint, it almost feels like we know because we eat it all the time. So like it feels like I know about food because I see it, I live with it. It's here when we celebrate, right? It's here when we grieve. It's here when and all parts of our lives. But this viewpoint of like, you should understand your food. You should understand the risk of your food. You should understand how as your body change, or you go through things like pregnancy, right? Or even other diseases, how does that impact what you should and should not eat, right? And it's all about how it interacts with your body and the risk, right, that the food poses. So it's one of those things that's like, when you want to know this information as it relates to your health and as it relates to, you know, how you live your life.
Yes. And you know, part of what we will say is that if we report, let's say, on dark chocolate and cadmium, also remember you eat other sources of potential cadmium contamination. So it's additive. So yes, take out dark chocolate, but also consider it maybe in some other parts of your diet too, and you may have to make even further adjustments to your diet if this is one of the things you're concerned about. If you're not worried about it, okay. But it is a total dietary consideration when you're thinking about food safety. So
I think we just found another use for the term we all love to use in food a lot, which is trust but verify. Do we apply it to what we eat at home enough?
Right. Yeah. So true.
And if not, Consumer Reports is a great place to look to help with our verify.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Brian, I do appreciate you even saying, like, how do you become a member? How do we find out more information? So if you want to just repeat, like, if someone's like, where do I find more information? How do I become a member of Consumer Reports? How do
Yeah, sure. In fact, I'm happy to give folks a code that allows for 30 days free access, so that you can test out the website and take it for a test drive, if you will, and check out all of the content across the spectrum. Cars, homes, food, baby, etc. So you go to cr.org/food advocacy. Food advocacy being one word. So cr.org/food advocacy. And it'll ask for an email address, and you get 30 days free, and feel free to check it out, and hopefully you'll like it and stay aboard.
Awesome. We'll make sure we put it in the comments.
Yes.
So people will have
And Tia, most of the food safety work is in front of the paywall. And then the magazine articles, the online articles that we've mentioned here should still be up and available. So if you wanted to check out our dark chocolate story, chocolate bars, or the subsequent testing we did afterwards, you should still be able to see that. We also talk about how dynamic the food space is. So sometimes we'll test something and then magically it'll disappear off the market because maybe we found heavy metals in that particular baby food, right? And so remember that, that's what we could find and test at that point, but it may not be available anymore because maybe we did something,
Okay. That's good to know.
It is.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you, Jim and Brian, for spending this time with us, for sharing with our audience. And of course, I have takeaways too, since I was jotting down some notes as well.
Yeah.
But really appreciate having you here and sharing so we can learn more.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yes,
and thanks for having us.
Yes, and thank you to our audience who's here listening and being a part of the conversation. Reach out to us if you need any more information or need us to connect you. We're happy to do that. We'll make sure we put the link in the chat so that you can come back and get that link and take advantage of the free 30 days. So thank you for that.
Yes. Wonderful. Well, and of course, for our audience, we will be back here at the same time, same place next week. So make it a great week. And until then, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.